My name is Mara Calloway. I am 34 years old. 3 months after my wedding, my sister sat my husband down and told him the real reason I had left my job 2 years earlier. She told him I had been fired for stealing from the register. He went quiet for 3 days, barely speaking to me, and I could feel the weight of something shifting between us that I did not know how to stop. Then my former boss knocked on our front door at our housewarming party with a gift bag and a smile, and what she said standing in that doorway undid everything my sister had built in one quiet conversation. Welcome back. I need to start a little further back than the housewarming, because the story only makes sense if you understand what actually happened at that job and why I had never given my husband the full version of it before my sister decided to give him her version instead. I grew up in a mid-sized city in Ohio, the second of three daughters. My older sister Diane is 3 years ahead of me, and our dynamic for most of our adult lives could be summarized fairly simply. Diane was the daughter my mother understood. They thought similarly, communicated in the same register, had the same instinct for social performance that made them both good at presenting a particular version of things to people outside the family. I was never quite that kind of person. I have always been more direct, more private, slower to perform warmth I do not actually feel. That difference between Diane and me was a source of low-level friction throughout our 20s that neither of us ever formally addressed, mostly because it never escalated into anything dramatic enough to require a real conversation. We were not close, but we were not openly hostile either. We showed up to the same family events, exchanged texts on birthdays, and maintained the surface of a functional sisterly relationship without either of us investing much in what was underneath it. I worked for 6 years at a regional grocery chain, starting in my mid-20s after a period of figuring out what direction I wanted my career to take. I started as a cashier, moved into a shift supervisor role after about 2 years, and by year 4 had been promoted to assistant store manager at one of their busier locations on the east side of the city. It was a job I was genuinely good at and took seriously, and for most of those 6 years I had a clean record and a reputation inside the company for being reliable and fair with the people I managed. In my 6th year, something happened that I have thought about almost every day since. Not with regret exactly, but with the complicated feeling of having made a choice under pressure that cost me more than I ever anticipated. I had a cashier working under me named Cora, a woman in her early 50s who had been at that store since before I started there. Cora was a good worker, quiet and careful, and she had a situation at home that I had become aware of through normal workplace proximity over several years. She was supporting her adult daughter, who had a serious illness that had made steady employment impossible for her, and Cora had been carrying the financial weight of that on a grocery store wage for years. One Thursday evening, near the end of a shift, I caught an irregularity on the register Cora had been working, a pattern that did not quite add up when I ran the end-of-day numbers. I pulled the surveillance footage to understand what had happened. What I saw was Cora pocketing a small amount of cash, less than $40 that day, in a way that was clumsy enough to make clear this was not a habit she had been practicing long. I sat in the back office with that footage for a long time that evening. The formal protocol was clear. I was required to report it to the store manager, who would have escalated to corporate, and Cora would have been terminated and likely referred for criminal prosecution. Given that the company had a zero-tolerance policy on register theft that had been applied consistently across other cases I had seen during my time there. I did not follow the formal protocol. Instead, I went to Cora before she left that night and told her, privately, what I had seen. I told her I was not going to report it, that I was going to adjust the daily count in a way that would bury the discrepancy, and that I needed her word that this was a one-time thing, driven by a specific crisis, rather than the beginning of a pattern. Cora cried for about 5 minutes in the break room. She told me she had received an unexpected medical bill that week, that she had no other way to cover, that she had panicked, and that she was deeply ashamed. I believed her, partly because I had worked alongside her for years and knew her character, and partly because the amount was small enough and the circumstances personal enough that it felt like a human failure rather than a calculated theft. I falsified the end-of-day count. I covered it. And I told no one. That decision held for about 2 months. Then a routine internal audit, the kind the company ran periodically on all locations, flagged an irregularity in that specific shift's records that did not reconcile with the surveillance timestamp on the original footage. An investigator was brought in. Within about a week, the investigation had worked back to me, to the adjustment I had made, and to the footage I had seen and not reported. I was called into a meeting with the store manager and a regional human resources representative. I told them the truth, all of it, including what I had witnessed Cora do and why I had chosen to cover it rather than report it. They appreciated the honesty, I think, but it did not change the outcome. Falsifying company records was a terminable offense regardless of the intent behind it, and the decision had been made before I sat down in that meeting. I was let go, effective immediately. Cora was also let go, and a decision was made at the corporate level not to pursue criminal charges against either of us, given the relatively small amount involved and the cooperation both of us provided during the investigation. That was a relief, though it did not change the significant professional and financial disruption that losing that job created for me. The termination itself was handled privately. I was not given a severance package, but was allowed to resign on paper rather than having termination marked on my official employment record, a small courtesy the company extended, given my otherwise clean 6-year history. The human resources representative told me this was as good an outcome as I could have hoped for given the circumstances, and I think she was right. I spent the 6 months after that rebuilding. I found work at a smaller independent grocery operation, took a lateral pay cut to do it, and over the following year and a half worked my way back up into a management role. By the time I met my husband James, I had been at the new job for about 8 months, was performing well, and had largely moved forward from what had happened. I met James at a mutual friend's dinner party about 2 years after leaving that job. He was an engineer at a civil planning firm, thoughtful and measured in the way engineers often are. Someone who trusted slowly but completely once that trust was established. We dated for 14 months before he proposed, and during that time the topic of why I had left my previous position came up once, early in our relationship, in the casual way employment history does when two people are getting to know each other. I told him I had left under difficult circumstances, that there had been a management decision I had handled poorly, and that I preferred not to go into the details at that stage of our relationship. He accepted that without pushing, which I took as a sign of respect for the boundary I was setting rather than a permanent avoidance I was committing to. I had every intention of telling him the full story at some point, when it felt like the right moment, when I trusted that what I told him would be held in the context of everything else he knew about who I was. That moment never quite came on its own terms, because I kept finding other things to talk about, better times that never arrived, and gradually the specific facts of what had happened at that job receded into the background of a relationship that was otherwise honest and close. I was not hiding it maliciously. I was postponing a conversation that felt hard in a way I had not yet figured out how to start. James and I got married in a small ceremony with about 60 guests, both our families, a handful of close friends. Diane was there, naturally, in her capacity as my sister, and was pleasant throughout the weekend in the way she usually was at events where social performance was expected. I did not think much about her during the wedding itself. I was too occupied with everything else. The first 3 months of our marriage were genuinely good. We had moved into a house we had purchased together shortly before the wedding, a 3-bedroom in a neighborhood we both liked, and were settling into the rhythm of shared domestic life in the way that first year of marriage tends to unfold. New systems, new negotiations, a pleasant kind of ordinary disruption. About 11 weeks after the wedding, James came home from work on a Tuesday evening, quieter than usual. I noticed it but did not immediately probe, assuming he had had a hard day at the office. But by dinner he still had not offered much beyond single-sentence answers to basic questions. And by the time we had cleared the dishes, I knew something specific was sitting with him, rather than just general work fatigue. I asked him directly what was going on. He was quiet for a long moment before he told me that Diane had called him that afternoon. He said she had told him she was calling because she cared about him and felt he deserved to know something important before it came out another way. She told him I had been fired from my previous job 2 years before we met, not resigned, fired, for stealing cash from the register. She said she felt terrible keeping it from him, but her conscience would not let her stay quiet now that we were married. I sat across the kitchen table from my husband and felt something very specific happen inside me. The sensation of a version of events you have not yet told being taken out of your hands and handed to someone else in a form you did not choose and cannot fully correct now that it has been introduced. I told James immediately, in the same conversation, that what Diane had told him was partially true and substantially incomplete. I told him the full story that night, every detail, Cora, the footage, the decision I had made, the audit, the termination, all of it, the way I should have told him months or years earlier, rather than letting the postponed conversation become a vulnerability someone else could exploit. He listened to everything without interrupting, which was characteristic of how James engaged with difficult conversations. When I finished, he said he needed some time to think, and he retreated into a quiet that lasted for the better part of 3 days. I want to be honest about those 3 days, because they were genuinely the hardest of our marriage up to that point, and possibly of the years I had known him. James did not leave, did not raise his voice, did not make any declarations. But he was present in a way that felt suspended, like a person deciding something rather than someone who had already decided. He was polite and distant in a way that told me the thing he was working through was serious, not performative processing but genuine uncertainty about something fundamental. On the 3rd evening, he came to me and sat down and said he was not troubled by what I had done at that job, at least not in the way I might have expected him to be. He said he could understand the choice I had made for Cora, could see how a person with a certain kind of character might make exactly that decision in that moment, even knowing it was against the rules and carried risk. What had been harder for him, he said, was the 2 years of not telling him. The specific awareness that I had known this thing about myself that I thought might cost me something with him, and had chosen not to find out, had chosen instead to let it sit in the background and hope the moment never came. He said he was not angry, but he was recalibrating, and that would take a few days to settle. I told him that was fair. I told him he was right, that I had avoided telling him, that my reasons had felt self-protective at the time, in a way I was not proud of in retrospect, and that if I could go back I would have told him earlier. Not because the outcome would necessarily have been different, but because he deserved the information and I had not trusted him enough with it. That conversation helped. Not immediately and not completely, but it opened something that had been closed during those 3 days, and over the following week we moved back toward a normal equilibrium, carefully, the way you move after something has shifted that both people are aware of. Diane and I did not speak during this period. I sent her a text 3 days after James told me about her call, a short one that said I knew what she had done and I would like to talk about it when I was ready. She responded with a long message that I read once and did not reply to. Something about acting out of concern for James, about feeling like I had been withholding something important from the family, about how she hoped I would understand her position when the emotion settled. I was not ready to engage with any of that reasoning yet, and I did not. The housewarming party happened about 3 weeks later. We had been planning it since before the Diane situation arose, had invited about 25 people, a mix of friends from both sides, and a few neighbors we had been meaning to properly meet since moving in. I had considered canceling it when everything happened, but James had encouraged me not to, said it was something we had been looking forward to, and that retreating from plans because of an outside disruption did not feel right to him. Among the people I had invited was my former boss, Sandra Hewitt. Sandra had reached out to me about a year after my termination, completely unexpectedly, with a brief email saying she had thought about how things had gone and wanted me to know she respected the decision I had made for Cora, even if the company's rules had not left her any option but to proceed the way she had. We had stayed in irregular contact since then, occasional emails, a coffee once, the kind of professional acquaintance that exists outside the formal relationship of employer and employee. I liked her. I respected her. She was someone I had wanted James to meet in a normal, casual context, well before any of this happened, which is why she had been on the list. I had not thought, in the days between the Diane conversation and the housewarming, about the fact that Sandra was coming and what that might mean in the context of everything James now knew. The party was on a Saturday afternoon in October, one of those clear fall days that makes an outdoor gathering easy and pleasant. People arrived in clusters over the first hour, the house filled with the particular comfortable noise of a group of people who like the hosts and are pleased to be welcomed into a new space. James moved through the party with more ease than I had seen from him in the previous 3 weeks, which I took as a sign that things between us were genuinely stabilizing rather than just politely suspended. Sandra arrived about 45 minutes into the party, on her own, with a bottle of wine and a small wrapped gift. I met her at the front door and hugged her and was just starting to introduce her to the couple standing behind me, when James appeared at my shoulder the way he does at parties, naturally drawn to wherever I am.
I introduced them simply, without preface or wait. Sandra, this is my husband James.
James, this is Sandra. She was my boss at my old job a few years back. I said it the way you say something when you are not thinking about how much context the other person is now running that sentence through. Sandra looked at James and said, genuinely warm, that she had been looking forward to meeting him, that Mara was one of the best people she had ever managed, that she was still annoyed they had lost her the they did. Then she said something I had not expected. Something she offered simply and naturally as the kind of thing you say when you are speaking to someone's spouse about a person you both know. She said she wanted him to know that what Mara had done for Cora was one of the most genuinely decent things she had seen in 20 years of managing people. She said Mara had made a mistake in how she handled it, and she'd had to enforce the rules, but the instinct behind it was completely right. She had been protecting someone who could not protect herself. She said all of this in the doorway, with the couple behind her still waiting to come in, with other guests moving past us inside the house, in the way people say things at parties when they do not realize they are delivering a verdict on something they do not know is still being deliberated. James stood there for a moment, and I watched something happen in his face that I recognized because I know his face well by now. It was the specific expression he makes when a thing he has been holding in his mind rearranges itself into something different from what it had been a moment before. He shook Sandra's hand and said it was really good to meet her. He said it like he meant it, which he did, because James does not say things he does not mean. Sandra came inside, the party continued, and after she had made her way toward the kitchen where the drinks were set up, James put his hand on my lower back and said quietly, against the noise of the gathering, that he thought he understood it better now. He did not elaborate, and I did not ask him to. We had been talking for weeks by then. I knew what he meant. The conversation with Diane happened about 2 weeks after the housewarming. I had given myself the time I needed before initiating it, not because I was building toward a confrontation, but because I wanted to go into it from a place of actual clarity rather than residual anger. We met for coffee, just the two of us, at a place equidistant from our houses. I let her talk first because I wanted to understand the version of events she was operating from before I said anything about my own version. She said again what she had written in her text, that she had felt James deserved to know the truth about something important, that she had been sitting with the information for years and felt that once we were married it was no longer something she could hold privately. I asked her how she had known. She said she had heard it from our mother, who had heard it from an aunt who knew someone connected to the company. The kind of indirect chain of information that circles back in smaller communities where people have enough overlap that these things travel. I asked her when she had found out. She said about a year before I met James, which meant she had been holding it, as she put it, for approximately 3 years before choosing the specific moment she did to release it. I told her I was not going to argue about whether what she had done came from genuine concern or from something more complicated than that, because I suspected we would never agree on it, and that was not really the point. I told her the point, for me, was that she had made a choice to intervene in my marriage with a partial truth, delivered to my husband without my knowledge, in a way designed to land before I had any opportunity to provide context. She said she did not see it that way. I told her I understood she did not, and that her seeing it differently did not change what the effect had been. I told her that James and I had gotten through it, that our marriage was fine, that what she had done had not accomplished whatever she had hoped it might. And I told her that for the foreseeable future I was going to need some distance from her, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a practical one, because I no longer trusted that she would handle information about my life with the discretion I had previously assumed she would. She cried a little at that point, which I had not expected. She said she had not meant to hurt us, and I believe that was at least partly true. I think Diane has a habit of telling herself that the things she does from complicated motivations are purely well-intentioned, and I think she had built a version of this story where she was the responsible sister protecting a man she cared about from being deceived, rather than a sister using old secondhand information to insert herself into a marriage at a moment of vulnerability. We have not spoken much since that coffee. A text on her birthday, which I sent. A brief exchange about a family event. The surface of a relationship without what used to be underneath it, however thin that had always been. James and I have talked about all of it several more times since October. The way married people process things that have shaken them, returning to it at different angles as new moments remind them of it. He told me once, a few months after the housewarming, that what Sandra had said in the doorway had mattered to him not because it exonerated me exactly, but because it grounded the story in a real person who had been there, who had made the same independent judgment about who I was as he had made over years of knowing me. He said it felt like evidence of something he had already chosen to believe, arriving at the right moment. I think about Sandra standing in that doorway sometimes, with her wine bottle and her gift bag, saying what she said about Cora and 20 years of managing people, not knowing it was landing in the middle of something she could not have known was still unresolved. I think about the timing of it, 3 weeks after a conversation that had shaken us. 3 weeks of careful restabilization that maybe needed one more piece of grounding before it fully settled. There is something almost disorienting about the idea that a party guest arriving with wine and a wrapped gift, saying something generous and offhand about a former colleague, could carry that much weight in a moment she was completely unaware of. But that is how it happened, and I am grateful for it in a way that still surprises me when I think about it directly. I also think sometimes about Cora, who I have not seen or spoken to since we were both walked out of that building on the same afternoon. I do not know how she is doing, or whether her daughter ever got better, or whether the $40 was worth what it ended up costing both of them. I hope she found her way through it. I hope the kindness I tried to extend to her, however badly executed in terms of the rules I broke, landed somewhere useful in her life, even if I will never know how. The kitchen renovation I had originally been saving for before any of this happened, the one I had been planning for years before James and before the wedding and before all of it, finally happened this past spring. We did it together, choosing things we both liked, spending more time on the decisions than a kitchen renovation probably required because we were both enjoying the process of building something permanent in a house that had become genuinely ours. It took longer than I planned, and it looks better than I expected, which feels like a fairly accurate description of most things that turn out to matter. That is my story. One decision made for the right reasons in the wrong way. One sister who could not let old secondhand information sit where it had been sitting. And a former boss who knocked on a front door at exactly the right moment without knowing what she was walking into.